Welcome to this opportunity to meet Sue Cox. Sue Cox is a survivor of clergy sexual abuse, a therapist, teacher, and activist. She is also the founder and head of two organizations. She founded Smart UK, now in its 21st year, which offers professional teaching for healthcare workers in the neuroscience of addiction. She also co-founded Survivors Voice Europe, which is an international charitable organization to connect, support, and empower survivors of clergy abuse. Sue and her team's latest two-day workshop, Winning the Battle of the Abused Brain, has been highly sought after in the UK and will be coming to the US in September 2015. Workshop facilitators offer participants the benefit of over 50 years of knowledge and experience working with abuse and addiction.
It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Sue Cox. You've already been introduced to me. Very, very humbling to hear those introductions. No pressure on me, hey? So I hope I'm not going to disappoint you. I am the co-founder of Survivors Voice Europe. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But first of all, to give context, I need to tell you a little bit about me. Now, my story is pretty well documented. I'm not going to... It's not a very pleasant subject, certainly not for your lunch. It's not the sort of thing you want to kind of talk about on Mother's Day over lunch. But I kind of think if we don't talk about it, it becomes even more ugly. So talking about it is necessary for me to give you context. So I was not born into a Catholic household. I was actually adopted into a Catholic household. I was bought, actually, by the people just after the war. There were lots of babies around in England after the war, and I was one of them, and I was bought and brought up in a fiercely Catholic household. The kind that you probably all know about, the kind where everything but breathing is sinful, where pretty much everything is ruled by guilt and fear and shame. And, you know, when I was a child, I remember being very small, and every time I did something wrong, I was told it was like going up to the baby Jesus in the pram and slapping his face really hard, complete with gestures. So from very early on, we were all brought up to fear terribly, and also to feel lower than a snake's belly in the grass. When I was 5, I was told by my family to kneel and pray for a cousin of mine to die, because he was about to embark upon marriage to a divorcee, and his parish priest told his mother, my aunt, that he'd be better off dead than living in sin. So aged 5, I was told with the family to kneel down and pray for Teddy to have a happy death as soon as possible. So all my grown-up years, I felt that every time I put a foot wrong, people were praying for me to die. This is the kind of stuff that's often not talked about a great deal when we talk about the Catholic clergy and sexual abuse. I was first abused when I was 10. It was the night before my confirmation in the church, and it was a priest who lives in our home. And I was 10 years old. I'm 68 this year, so you can imagine all those years ago, we were pretty naive children. And of course, the Catholic Church and Catholic people have their own kind of language for anything vaguely sexual, so one didn't talk about it at all. So I was an incredibly naive 10-year-old. I think probably I was told that I always should keep my hands over my chest when I went to bed. The implication was that I would die with a cross on my chest, but the reality was that we were not allowed to touch our bodies. So this distorted attitude towards sexual matters was part of the deal. I was abused by this man the night before the confirmation, and I was traumatised, completely traumatised. I didn't have the language to describe what had happened, and I also thought this was my fault, because the victim is always blamed in the church. I felt guilty because this man was a holy man, and I had obviously caused him to do something which was dreadful. So I went on a downward spiral from then. I had nobody I could talk to. I started to self-harm. I had an eating disorder, and gradually I started to be not the person that I normally was. That abuse continued until I was 13. The last time it happened, I was raped by this man in my home, in my bed, in my bedroom. My mother, who was downstairs, heard him, came up the stairs, and I thought I was going to be rescued. And what she did was nothing. She said that I should pray for him, that this was probably part of God's plan. And she told me my nightie was torn, I'm asthmatic, I was having an asthma attack. The following day at breakfast, he was being treated like the deity, that priests often are. So yes, Father, no, Father, 3 bags full, Father, would you like another cup of tea? I felt sacrificial. I felt of no consequence, and that continued pretty much for most of my life. So when David and Dennis introduced me and say all those nice things about me, believe me, I sit in the corner thinking, that's not me. I am not worthy of all of that. That's how long these things stay in your head. So that's a little bit about me. It's necessary to talk about these things because otherwise there's no context about what we're talking about. Now, I am co-founder of Survivors Voice Europe. We are all people who've been abused by clergy. So none of us are kind of volunteers or anything like that. We're people who've been abused by Catholic clergy. And we're called Survivors Voice for a reason. And that's largely because for millennia we couldn't speak at all about this subject. This was a taboo subject. People couldn't speak at all about this subject. We had no voice. So that's one of the reasons why that voice, the name is Survivors Voice Europe. I could tell you lots of statistics about childhood sexual abuse. I could tell you all about these things, about the psychological damage, about the self-harm, the addictions, the suicidal attempts, the abuse, the continued abuse. I could tell you all about the mental health problems, and I could give you lots of statistics about the child abuse, clergy abuse worldwide, because I know quite a bit about that. Today, because I know it's Mother's Day, I'm going to concentrate on something else, because I wanted to make it, with your permission, I want to make it a bit more personal, because I'm a mother. What I want to talk about, really, is to talk about how a person is put on a distorted life path. From that moment, you are disoriented and actually no longer are the person that you were intended to be. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So rather than go too much into the statistics of mental health and physical abuse and suicides and all of those things, which I'm happy to talk about at some point, but I'd rather really kind of concentrate on this alienation, because anybody who's abused by the church has been alienated from that part of what it means to be human. And that alienation is probably, for me, has always been the worst bit. The person gets cut off from what it means to be human. So we're not just going to concentrate on the damage. I want to look at the full picture. As you know, as I'm sure you're very well aware of, we are a social species. We learned very early on in our evolution how necessary it was for us to be in packs, in teams, in tribes, in villages, and that part of that social cohesion is incredibly important. It's almost as fundamental as breathing. As a social species, we've always needed each other, so that connection with human beings has always been terribly, terribly important. With abuse by the Catholic clergy, the Church has created a sort of subculture of people who don't quite belong anywhere, people like me. So I didn't belong in the Church, but I couldn't function out of it because I was a child. I didn't belong in the family, but I couldn't function without it, so I didn't belong there either. In school, in work, in college, I became an alien in a world that I so badly wanted to belong to. So that's really what I want us to look at today, really. The imperative to keep the silence, to keep this quiet, is the one thing that overrules everything that you do. So I was charged with never talking about this, so it became an imperative to not talk about it. After I was 13, after I felt sacrificial, my whole life went into a downward spiral. I did have an eating disorder. I self-harmed quite badly. I became an alcoholic. I was an alcoholic by the time I was 15. In as much as I was having blackouts, I didn't know where I'd been. I became a drug addict. I made very serious suicide attempts. The time I was 17, I ran away from home and got married to somebody very violent, so out of the frying pan into the fire, because this distorted life path meant that one is permanently, looking for somewhere to belong. I think I felt a little bit like tourists going through the china shop of life, not quite knowing how to not bump into things, watching other people to see how I should behave. Now today I know in the US it's Mother's Day, and I am a mother. By the time I was 29, I had 6 children. And so I was still doing what the church expected me to do, churning out babies. But I know today's Mother's Day. But as a woman with dirty, shameful secrets, it's not easy to be like other women. In England, I'm sure you have the same saying that little girls are sugar and spice and all things nice, and that's what little girls are made of. It's not easy to be sugar and spice if you've got these dirty secrets. It's not something that you can talk about in the brownies. It's not something you can share when you're having giggly moments with other girls. From the age of 10, I was already self-harming, and I had an eating problem, and I had terrible, terrible secrets. So it's not easy, it's not what best friends are made of, it's not the kind of thing you can talk about in a sleepover. So keeping those secrets was very, very important. When other girls were teenagers, was forming bonds and creating friendships that often last a lifetime, I had to hide away. I had to cover my body because I was covered in scabs and scars and all sorts of damage. It's not something that you can discuss when you're discussing your first crush or your first kiss. It's not the kind of thing that you can actually talk about. So that alienation continues. When other girls were dressing up and sharing giggly secrets, their first kiss or their first sexual experience, I had to hide away. I could not say that I had been raped by a fat, dirty, drunken, smelly paedophile. That's me, age 13, just after the particular rape had happened. I was already quite seriously emotionally and mentally disturbed. That I can say in retrospect. I don't know how disturbed I am now, certainly at that age. In this day and age, I would have been diagnosed as being seriously mentally and emotionally disturbed. I felt like this. I felt suicidal. I felt afraid. I didn't belong anywhere. I felt somebody somewhere was praying for me to die all the time. So it's like the sword of Damocles hanging over me, and I had to keep these terrible secrets. So that was the imperative. I was cutting myself. I was hiding my body. I was alone. I started playing truant. Prior to that, I was a reasonably bright child, but I started to bunk off school. I started to hide. My work really suffered, and by the time I was 15, I discovered alcohol. So this is me age at 15. I was already an alcoholic. I often had blackouts. I didn't know where I'd been. I had little respect for myself. Why would I? Nobody else had any respect for me. I had no one to talk to. And then I married somebody very violent. So it's a thoroughly unpleasant and sordid story. I was like an alien watching the world, and an alien watching the world that I very badly wanted to belong to. I was like an alien impersonating a human being, very much like a chameleon. I'd watch what other people did and try and be like that. I had a desperate, desperate need to be good. I was obsessed with being good. I think that was part of the indoctrination. It was an imperative to be good. So these are kind of images that are seeing all over the place in terms of Mother's Day today. And I am a mother. I have 6 children. As I say, even then, I would not swap any one of my children. I adore them. They are my life. However, if I'm honest, looking back, I was still trying to look for acceptance, and the church was telling me that I should be having children. So I marched my kids down to the front of the church, saying how wonderful they were, because that connection was still very important to me. And they saved my life. They were what saved my life. So I was playing at being a mother, really. Any skills I've learned about being a mother, I've learned when my kids are now well grown. We were talking about this morning. It's very easy for me. People look at me and say, "Oh, you've got 6 kids. How do you do this? How do you do that?" And I can tell them. You ask my kids if I did that. No, because I was not the cuddly sort of mother that they had. Anything I've learned about parenting, I've learned long after my children were grown. But I loved them more than my life. And at age 29, I had a moment of clarity. And I realised that if I didn't do something about this situation, then there was going to be a tragedy in my home. And that would involve my children. So, age 29, I did the first thing that was sensible to do and deal with that which was killing me, and that was booze and drugs. So I stopped drinking and stopped using any mind-altering chemicals. I haven't had a mind-altering chemical now for 38 years, so it's easy, it's a long way away to do so. Sensible at the time to deal with that which is killing you, rather than start getting into all sorts of other stuff. But I still didn't talk about the clergy abuse, because it's still an imperative to keep quiet. It's still something I couldn't talk about. It's not something you can share at a young wives group. When people are asking, well, how did you lose your virginity? You don't tell them that it was this fat, dirty, smelly, drunken paedophile who raped you and then got away with it. So it's further isolation from other women. So in many ways, survivors like me are damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you keep it quiet, it's very hard. If you talk about it, it's doubly hard. So the dilemma really is what to do about it. I joined many things as I was growing up. I was a great yearning for something. I had a great sense of homesickness. I was very much like a chameleon. I studied many things. I had I envied anybody who really knew where they belonged and how that everything was the way it normally should be, that they had parents and grandparents and things that they could relate to and no kind of dirty secrets. I joined groups. If my children were involved in something at school, then I would get involved with it too. My daughter had an Irish boyfriend. Suddenly we started going to all the Irish dances. I studied Buddhism and I'd started to meditate. I probably could tell you about the Book of Mormon. I kind of was looking for this place to be. I became a vegetarian. I started all about cooking. This sense of loss of belonging, for me, was the worst part of being alienated. There was one place that I always belonged, and that was with other disenfranchised people. I had always felt more at home with other drunks, with addicts and people that were trying to get well. So I suppose it was inevitable that ultimately I would go back to college and learn to be an addictions counsellor, which is what I did. And I was with that for many years. My ex-husband left. It was the best thing he could do because he no longer beat me up. However, he did leave me with 6 children under 12 and I was homeless for a while and no money. So I had to get out, get off my backside and earn a living for me and those children. In fact, we were like a force to be reckoned with. It was like me and the kids against the world, really. So I went to work in addiction. I started to run an addiction centre in Coventry, which is a town in England. And that was my life for a long time. I kept on studying because I had a real sense of being annoyed, I was going to use a different word, that my education had been interrupted and the things that I'd really have liked to have done I wasn't able to do anymore. But I loved working with addiction and it became my life. I went on and suddenly I started to get this moment of clarity. More moments of clarity arrived. You were talking earlier about how one becomes an atheist. Well, it didn't happen for me overnight. It wasn't an event, it was a process. There was a gradual erosion. There was a gradual getting rid of all of the indoctrination and all the layers of crap that had been put on me all, and it took a long, long time. I didn't honestly know much about faith. I don't ever remember thinking, well, I believe in that. Because in those days, one was not actually supposed to question what one believed in. You just simply did what you were told. So I don't think I ever actually had any real faith that I chose for myself. I just was very fearful and traumatised. My lawyer friend calls it Catholic psychotrauma. I think it's not far wrong. I think it is one of those things that stays with people, forever, and it's very, it's very difficult to shake off. So that's a restaurant. One of the things that did happen, really for me, the final straw came with heartache, really. I had met my second husband, the man I'm married to now. In his wisdom, he took on me and 6 children, which is really quite a remarkable thing. And I was starting to get happy for the first time and feel guilty because I was not supposed to get married because somebody would be praying for me to die. So there was this sort of Hercules hanging over there. I had to talk to him about my abuse because it would have been unfair not to, and he was incredibly supportive. Shortly after we got together, my older son was killed in a car crash. Nicholas was 19, and I was heartbroken. My heart was broken. I thought I would die. I didn't want to use, I didn't want to drink, but I didn't want to live either, and it felt like it was for nothing. And in many ways, it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. However, what happened was I was told by my family, the ones that were still there, that the reason that Nicholas had died was because I had got happy, because I'd met somebody and I'd started to consider getting married. I was also told that Nicholas had been taken away because he probably would have gone wrong, and so God had spared him this. And those final kind of cruel jibes at a time when I was vulnerable, grieving, and those of you that are mothers know that it's the worst thing you could possibly imagine, and I can tell you that when it does happen, it's far worse than you can possibly imagine. It was the final straw, and it enabled me to get away, finally, from that toxic, malignant environment which I had been brought up in.